Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. Alabama in 1854 was a land of strict social codes, deep-seated traditions, and rigid expectations, particularly for women of prominent families. Among the sprawling cotton plantations and grand estates, the idea of a young woman's value was often tied exclusively to her prospects for marriage. Families measured their daughters in terms of dowries, social connections, beauty, and temperament. And for one young woman, Annabelle Whitcomb, life had begun with the misfortune of being deemed inadequate by the very people whose approval mattered most. Annabelle was the eldest child of Jonathan Whitcomb, a man of considerable wealth and influence in the county. His mansion, a stately house of white columns and shuttered windows, stood at the center of vast fields where the cotton crops swayed in the warm southern breeze. The Whitcomb name carried weight in the community, commanding respect at church gatherings, social balls, and town councils. Yet within this grand household, Annabelle's position was paradoxical, born into privilege, yet deprived of what society promised to women like her: a husband, a family, and social validation. From an early age, Annabelle had been keenly aware of her father's disappointment. Unlike her younger sister Lillian, who possessed the grace and charm to attract admirers from neighboring plantations, Annabelle had always struggled to meet the expectations placed upon her. Her features, though not unattractive, lacked the delicate symmetry prized in the southern belles of the time. Her voice, soft and contemplative, did not carry the vivacity that animated social gatherings. Her mind, sharp and inquisitive, often wandered to subjects deemed inappropriate for young ladies: the workings of the plantation, the lives of the enslaved workers, and the inequities that shaped their world. Jonathan Whitcomb, a man whose identity was inseparable from societal approval, regarded his daughter's difference as a failure of breeding and a threat to the family name. "A woman must be presentable, desirable, and obedient," he would say to his wife in private moments, his tone a mix of frustration and disbelief. "If she cannot attract a husband, she reflects poorly upon all of us. Lillian understands this naturally. Annabelle, she does not." His disappointment was not tempered by affection, it was a judgment as absolute as the law of the land. As Annabelle entered her late teens, the pressure intensified. Invitations to social events became trials of endurance, each encounter with potential suitors a painful reminder of her father's assessment. She was subjected to scrutiny, her posture, her conversation, her clothing, and her manners analyzed with the meticulous attention of a merciless jury. Every slight misstep, an awkward laugh, a hesitation in speech, a visible disinterest in the frivolous chatter of young men, was catalogued as evidence of her inadequacy. In a society where appearances governed destiny, Annabelle felt the weight of envy. Chains binding her, restricting not just her movements, but her very identity. Her mother, a woman of quiet dignity and constrained empathy, offered little defense. Mrs. Whitcomb had been molded by the same social strictures and understood the stakes of maintaining appearances. She provided occasional comfort, whispered reassurances in the privacy of their shared chamber, and attempted to guide Annabelle in the art of charm and social grace. Yet even her maternal support was limited by fear. To openly defend her daughter was to risk the family's reputation and the wrath of Jonathan Whitcomb. And so Annabelle learned early that comfort came in fleeting moments, that solace was temporary, and that survival often meant submission to judgment. The community, ever vigilant, had begun to notice Annabelle's failure to attract suitors. Gossip, subtle at first, grew louder with each passing year. At church gatherings, whispers accompanied her measured steps down the aisle. At social balls, laughter followed her attempts at conversation. Annabelle felt the sting of exclusion, the isolating pressure of being marked as different. She learned to observe without participating fully, to smile without warmth, and to nod politely while her mind wandered to more meaningful matters. The plight of the enslaved workers she glimpsed in the distance, the labor of the fields, the quiet resilience of those denied agency, and the inequities that shaped every aspect of her world. Yet despite her struggles, Annabelle retained a spirit that refused to bend completely. She was inquisitive, perceptive, and brave in small ways. She asked questions about the plantation that others would not dare, wondered why the overseers wielded such unyielding power, and observed the subtle hierarchies among those who labored without recognition or reward. Her compassion extended even to the animals she cared for, the plants she nurtured, and the people around her. These qualities, while admirable in a moral sense, only served to reinforce her father's impatience. They marked her as unconventional, unsuitable for marriage, and ultimately expendable in the rigid calculations of inheritance and family prestige. The tension in the Whitcomb household reached its peak one evening after a particularly humiliating social gathering. Jonathan Whitcomb had hosted a dinner for influential neighbors, hoping to secure a potential match for Annabelle. The evening had been a disaster in his eyes. Annabelle's conversation had wandered to her observations of the plantation's workings. Her answers had lacked the polished flirtation he expected, and her behavior had seemed distracted, almost distant. The whispers of disapproval among the guests had not escaped Jonathan's notice, and by the time the carriage returned home, his patience had worn thin. In the quiet of the drawing room, he delivered his verdict. "Annabelle," he said, his voice cold and measured, "it has become clear that you will never bring honor to this family through marriage. You are unmarriageable. I cannot afford to indulge your whims any longer." The words struck with a force she had never experienced, cutting deeper than any harshness from peers or strangers. To be declared unmarriageable in a society that valued women primarily for their prospects was to be declared a failure of both identity and purpose. Annabelle's mother, seated nearby, looked away, unwilling to confront the severity of her husband's decision. She had long suspected that this moment would come, yet she had hoped for mercy, for compromise, for a gentler path. But Jonathan Whitcomb's mind was resolute. He saw no solution that preserved family honor and rectified the perceived failure. In his calculations, Annabelle's removal from the social sphere, her displacement from conventional female roles, was the only viable path. And so, Jonathan made the decision that would alter the course of Annabelle's life. He would send her to work alongside the enslaved people on the plantation. This was not merely punishment, it was a practical solution, a means to instill labor, humility, and purpose while simultaneously removing her from the scrutiny of polite society. To Jonathan, it was both corrective and expedient, a way to utilize his daughter's presence for the functioning of the estate, while resolving the embarrassment of her social inadequacy. Annabelle's reaction to this decree was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and humiliation. She had been trained for refinement, taught to manage delicate china, navigate social intricacies, and perform the duties of a genteel young lady. The idea of laboring in the fields, of living among those considered socially inferior, was alien and terrifying. The quarters, with their simple cabins, rough-hewn furniture, and constant toil, were a world apart from the polished floors and ornate chandeliers of the main house. She could not comprehend the reality she was about to enter. Yet even in her fear, a spark of defiance emerged. Annabelle questioned the fairness of her father's judgment, the morality of confining her to a life of labor, and the justice of a society that measured women solely by their ability to attract a husband. Her mind, sharp and inquisitive, began to formulate strategies for survival, for understanding, and perhaps even for asserting a form of agency in an environment where every action would be scrutinized, controlled, and interpreted through the lens of hierarchy and race. Her first steps toward the quarters were marked by apprehension and isolation. She observed the enslaved men and women as they worked in the fields, tending to crops with skill, resilience, and a stoic endurance born of necessity. She noticed the way they communicated through glances, gestures, and whispered words, a subtle language of survival that she could barely comprehend. The initial shock of displacement was compounded by the realization that she would now exist in a world where social rank, morality, and power intersected in ways far more complex than the parlors of her upbringing had ever revealed. In the first days among the enslaved, Annabelle's clumsiness and ignorance were painfully apparent. She struggled with physical tasks, misjudged the rhythm of labor, and spoke out of turn when attempting to inquire about routines or responsibilities. The workers observed her with a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and cautious judgment. Some whispered to one another, speculating on her origin, her purpose, and the motivations of the master. Others offered subtle guidance, small acts of teaching or correction, meant to help her adapt without attracting undue attention. In this new world, Annabelle had to learn quickly that knowledge, observation, and discretion were as valuable as skill or strength. Through humiliation, error, and gradual adjustment, Annabelle began the slow process of adaptation. She recognized that her father's decision, though cruel and rooted in societal prejudice, also provided an opportunity to observe, to learn, and to confront realities beyond the narrow confines of genteel society. The physical labor, harsh living conditions, and moral complexities of the quarters challenged her in ways that social gatherings and polite instruction never could. And with each day, she began to understand that the measures of worth imposed by her father and society were limited, superficial, and fundamentally flawed, yet the emotional toll was immense. Annabel grappled with feelings of rejection, humiliation, and resentment, alternating with moments of curiosity, empathy, and emerging self-awareness. She began to see the humanity of the enslaved workers in ways she had never before considered, recognizing both their suffering and their resilience. The stark contrast between the luxury of her upbringing and the harsh reality of life in the quarters forced her to reevaluate notions of privilege, morality, and justice. By the end of her first year, Annabel was no longer the naive, untested girl her father had condemned. She had endured physical strain, navigated social hierarchies, and absorbed lessons in empathy, discretion, and moral courage. Her character had begun to reshape itself, forged in the crucible of experience, observation, and interaction with people, whose lives had long been marginalized, constrained, and devalued. While society still labeled her unmarriageable, she had begun to recognize her own worth in ways that transcended the limited definitions imposed by family or culture. Annabel's journey of rejection and displacement set the stage for a larger transformation, a path that would take her from isolation and humiliation to moral insight, empathy, and agency. Her father's decision, intended as punishment, inadvertently opened a door to understanding, growth, and the awakening of conscience. In the quarters, she would confront injustice, navigate complex human relationships, and ultimately discover a form of identity that could never be measured by marriageability or societal approval. Jonathan Whitcomb's decision was not born of sudden anger, but of long-brewing frustration and rigid adherence to societal norms. In his mind, the matter was straightforward. Annabel, the eldest of his daughters, was failing to fulfill her essential role as a young woman of status. She was intelligent, curious, and perceptive, yes, but she lacked the charm, poise, and beauty that would secure a husband of suitable standing. Her idiosyncrasies, her refusal to feign interest in superficial conversation, and her disregard for the flattery of young suitors had all combined to shape Jonathan's assessment. To him, her value in the eyes of the community had diminished to nearly nothing. The Whitcomb estate had always been a symbol of careful calculation and social positioning. Jonathan prided himself on the family's appearances, the grand mansion, the manicured gardens, the rows of cotton stretching as far as the eye could see, and the propriety of his children. His younger daughter, Lillian, was everything he had hoped for, graceful, charming, and obedient to the societal scripts of femininity. Annabel, in contrast, posed a risk, not only to the family's reputation but to Jonathan's own sense of control. Her independent spirit, though admirable in some circles, was intolerable in a society where conformity was prized above all else. After years of failed attempts to mold her into the ideal young woman, Jonathan reached a breaking point. The dinners, church socials, and polite gatherings had yielded nothing. Annabel's awkwardness and lack of interest in courting remained unchanged. The whispers of the community, the raised eyebrows at every gathering, and the subtle mockery behind her back had only intensified his resolve. In his calculations, something more drastic was required. He needed a solution that would simultaneously remove the embarrassment from public view, redirect Annabel's energies, and instill discipline. The idea of sending Annabel to work alongside the enslaved people on the plantation was a decision rooted in both punishment and pragmatism. In Jonathan's mind, labor among the enslaved offered a dual benefit. It would humble Annabel by exposing her to work considered beneath her social station, and it would serve the family's interests by adding her presence to the daily operations of the estate. It was a solution that combined practicality with correction, a way to utilize his daughter while also signaling to the community that her failings were being addressed in a controlled, productive manner. The announcement of his decision was deliberate and unwavering. In the drawing room, Jonathan spoke with the authority that had governed the household for decades. "Annabel," he said, his tone precise, leaving no room for argument, "it is clear that your place is no longer within the social sphere. You have failed in the pursuit of a suitable match, and your presence in polite society is both unhelpful and unbecoming. Therefore, you will reside among the enslaved workers on this estate, performing tasks that will teach you discipline, humility, and the value of labor." The words struck Annabel like a physical blow. To be sent from the relative safety and refinement of the mansion into the quarters was not merely a change of scenery, it was a symbolic demotion, a public acknowledgement of failure, and a confrontation with a reality she had never known. She had grown up learning the lessons of etiquette, of composure, and of observing without questioning. Now she would be thrust into a world where physical endurance, practical skill, and keen observation determined survival, and where her social standing, previously unchallenged, would mean little. Jonathan's wife, a woman who had long internalized the expectations of her society, remained silent during the announcement. She had hoped that some compromise might be found, some gentler approach that would preserve the daughter's dignity while satisfying her husband's need for control. But Jonathan's resolve was unyielding, and Mrs. Whitcomb understood that defiance could provoke consequences not only for Annabel, but for the entire family. And so, she remained passive, offering only fleeting glances of sympathy, the weight of her compassion constrained by fear and social prudence. The household staff, upon receiving instructions regarding the daughter's reassignment, reacted with a mixture of curiosity, hesitation, and apprehension. The servants, seasoned in navigating the whims of the family, recognized the significance of Jonathan's decision. Annabel was no ordinary young woman. She was the daughter of the master, yet she was about to be placed among those whose lives were strictly controlled and whose labor sustained the very estate from which she came. The staff anticipated challenges, managing her unfamiliarity with physical work, guiding her through the routines of the quarters, and protecting her from both injury and embarrassment. The overseer, a stern man accustomed to managing the enslaved workforce with efficiency and authority, was given explicit instructions regarding Annabel's new role. He was to ensure that she adhered to the routines of labor, understood the hierarchies among the workers, and adjusted to the pace and rigor of daily tasks. The challenge was unique, training a young woman accustomed to refinement, whose social status had previously insulated her from physical toil, required patience and strategic oversight. Yet the overseer accepted the task, recognizing both the opportunity to demonstrate compliance with the master's wishes and the inherent risk of overseeing someone of Annabel's position. As the day of her relocation approached, Annabel experienced a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. She had imagined many fates as a consequence of her father's judgment: disappointment, isolat, or even forced marriage to a man she could not respect, but nothing prepared her for the reality of labor among the enslaved. The quarters, simple wooden cabins arranged along a dirt path, stood in stark contrast to the mansion's grandeur. The smell of smoke, sweat, and earth pervaded the air, and the sound of work, hoes scraping soil, murmured instructions, and occasional shouts, echoed across the fields. It was a world both alien and intimidating. Upon arrival, Annabel encountered a range of reactions from the enslaved workers. Some looked upon her with curiosity, assessing her intentions and capabilities. Others displayed skepticism or amusement, perceiving the incongruity of a young woman of her status attempting to navigate the realities of physical labor. A few, guided by wisdom and experience, offered quiet assistance, gestures of instruction, subtle corrections, and advice delivered with discretion. The initial days were a crucible of adjustment, as Annabel struggled to reconcile the expectations instilled by her upbringing with the practical demands of her new environment. Physical labor was more demanding than she had anticipated. Tasks that the enslaved workers executed with practiced skill challenged her in unexpected ways. Lifting heavy bundles of cotton, tending to crops under the unforgiving sun, and navigating the constant rhythm of fieldwork left her exhausted and frustrated. Each misstep, every failed attempt to match the pace of others, reminded her of the consequences of her previous privilege. The discipline required to endure these routines was exacting, a stark contrast to the structured lessons of etiquette and composure she had learned in the mansion. Beyond the physical challenges, Annabel had to navigate the social complexities of the quarters. She observed the hierarchies among the enslaved men and women, noting the subtle power dynamics that governed relationships, labor assignments, and daily interactions. Communication often occurred in coded language. Glances, gestures, and whispered words conveyed meaning that could protect or endanger. Annabel quickly realized that her position was precarious. She was neither fully of the household nor fully of the quarters, and her actions would be scrutinized from both sides. Despite her initial humiliation and discomfort, Annabel began to recognize the opportunity within her punishment. Exposure to the labor, The routines and the realities of the enslaved community provided insights that no social gathering or lecture could offer. She observed resilience, intelligence, and ingenuity in the people around her, qualities that had previously been invisible to her privileged perspective. The experience challenged her preconceptions about value, skill, and moral worth, forcing her to reconsider the narrow definitions of success imposed by her father and society. Jonathan Whitcomb, in issuing his decision, believed he was correcting a flaw and restoring order. Yet, he failed to anticipate the unintended consequences of placing Annabel among those whose lives required vigilance, adaptability, and moral fortitude. In his rigid worldview, humility would be instilled, obedience would be reinforced, and social embarrassment would be mitigated. What he could not foresee was the development of empathy, awareness, and resilience within his daughter, qualities that would grow through exposure to injustice, labor, and the quiet dignity of those he had long considered socially inferior. Annabel's first months in the quarters were a period of intense learning. She began to acquire practical skills, cooking, cleaning, mending, and fieldwork, while also observing the subtle social codes that maintained cohesion and survival. The enslaved workers, aware of her unfamiliarity and the potential danger of mistakes, provided instruction in small, deliberate doses. These lessons extended beyond practical knowledge. She learned discretion, patience, and the importance of observation. Every misstep carried a potential consequence, and every success reinforced her growing understanding of agency within constraint. The transition was not without tension. Annabel's presence disrupted established routines and hierarchies. Some workers resented her intrusion, fearing judgment or interference from the master's household. Others viewed her as a potential ally, someone who could be guided to contribute meaningfully, without threatening established norms. Through trial and error, negotiation and observation, Annabel began to find her place, balancing humility with assertion, curiosity with caution, and learning with respect. Her father's harsh decision, intended as punishment and correction, ultimately became a catalyst for transformation. Annabel's relocation to the quarters forced her to confront physical labor, moral ambiguity, social hierarchies, and personal limitation in ways that refined character and insight. While Jonathan Whitcomb imagined his actions would instill obedience and humility, the experience also cultivated empathy, observation, and moral awareness. Annabel's journey into the quarters was both exile and education, a crucible in which resilience, understanding, and emerging agency would take root. The weeks turned into months, and the initial shock of relocation gave way to adaptation. Annabel's perspective evolved as she observed the courage, skill, and intelligence required to navigate life within the quarters. Her initial resentment began to be tempered by recognition of human dignity, survival strategy, and moral complexity. The punishment her father imposed inadvertently offered lessons that the drawing room, the church pew, and the ballroom could never have taught. In conclusion, Jonathan Whitcomb's decision, rooted in societal expectation, personal frustration, and a desire for control, reshaped the trajectory of his daughter's life. What began as a measure of discipline and humiliation evolved into an unforeseen opportunity for growth, insight, and moral awakening. Annabel's journey into the quarters marked the beginning of a transformation, one that would challenge preconceptions, foster empathy, and ultimately redefine her understanding of herself, her family, and the society in which she lived. The day Annabel Whitcomb first stepped into the quarters, the air seemed to shift around her. The quarters were unlike anything she had experienced within the walls of the Whitcomb mansion. Gone were the polished floors, crystal chandeliers, and meticulously arranged furniture. In their place stood rows of small wooden cabins, their weathered walls telling stories of generations who had endured toil, hardship, and resilience. The path between the cabins was dust-laden, uneven, and scarred with the constant tread of bare feet. Smoke drifted lazily from cooking fires, mingling with the earthy aroma of tilled soil, sweat, and livestock. To Annabel, accustomed to refinement and structure, the quarters were an alien world, simultaneously intimidating and fascinating. As she approached, the enslaved workers paused in their labor to observe her. Eyes, curious, cautious, and occasionally amused, followed her every movement. Some of the older women exchanged subtle glances, silently debating whether she could endure the work, whether she was entitled to sympathy, or whether she represented yet another layer of intrusion from the master's household. Children playing near the cabins stopped mid-step, their games halting as they watched the young woman approach. Even the men in the fields, tending the cotton and the other crops, adjusted their pace to keep an eye on her, aware that her presence was both unprecedented and potentially disruptive. Annabelle's first encounter with the quarters was overwhelming. The noise, the rhythmic scrape of hose against soil, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional laughter or reprimand, was a stark contrast to the hushed elegance of the mansion. The physicality of labor, the intensity of heat, and the necessity of constant awareness unsettled her profoundly. Every movement required calculation, when to speak, when to act, when to observe quietly. She realized immediately that survival here depended on both attentiveness and restraint. Her initial tasks were modest yet revealing in their difficulty. She was asked to carry water from the nearby well to the cabins, a chore that demanded strength she had never exercised in earnest. The water, heavy in wooden buckets, threatened to spill with every step. She stumbled more than once, drawing suppressed chuckles from onlookers who had grown accustomed to the rhythm of such labor. Each mistake brought a mixture of embarrassment and shame. Annabelle quickly recognized that her previous life of ease and sheltered refinement had left her unprepared for the practical demands of survival in this environment. The enslaved women, seasoned in both labor and survival, became her first teachers. One woman, named Martha, who had been with the Whitcomb household for decades, approached Annabelle cautiously. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, but also tinged with a faint curiosity. "Steady your steps, young miss," she said softly, her voice carrying authority tempered with patience. "The water does not forgive mistakes, and neither does the world out here. Learn the rhythm, or you'll make it harder than it has to be." Martha's words were delivered gently but with a firmness that immediately impressed upon Annabelle the seriousness of her new reality. Other workers observed from a distance, whispering quietly among themselves. Some speculated about the reasons for her presence, her potential for endurance, and the motives of her father. Others debated whether they should offer guidance, intervene in her errors, or simply let her learn through trial and mistake. Their assessments were rapid and silent, shaped by years of navigating the delicate balance between survival, obedience, and discretion under the omnipresent authority of the master's household. Annabelle, despite her initial discomfort, approached the tasks with a mix of determination and trepidation. She recognized that failure here would carry consequences beyond embarrassment. In the quarters, missteps could be dangerous, inviting reprimand or derision, or even the inadvertent wrath of overseers. Quickly learned that observation was as critical as physical skill. Watching the workers, noting their techniques, and mimicking their movements allowed her to begin the slow process of adaptation. The social dynamics of the quarters added layers of complexity to her experience. Hierarchies existed not only between the enslaved and the household but within the enslaved community itself. Age, skill, experience, and temperament determined influence, respect, and authority. Annabelle had to navigate these subtle networks carefully. A wrong word, an ill-timed gesture, or a display of entitlement could alienate her or, worse, create resentment that would complicate her integration. She began to understand that humility, patience, and careful attention to social cues were essential tools for survival. Her initial interactions with the children of the quarters were instructive. They approached her cautiously, curious about the new presence in their midst, yet wary of her unfamiliarity. Some tested her patience, others attempted to teach her games or routines, and a few simply observed silently. Annabelle's attempts to engage were awkward at first, her manners from the mansion clashing with the rough-and-tumble play of the children. Yet over time she learned to navigate these interactions, understanding the importance of listening, adapting, and responding with empathy. Work in the fields presented another set of challenges. Annabelle quickly realized that physical labor required more than effort. It demanded endurance, technique, and constant vigilance. She struggled to keep pace, to mimic the deft motions of planting, weeding, and harvesting that the enslaved workers executed with efficiency born of necessity. Sweat poured from her brow. Muscles ached in ways she had never experienced, and her initial attempts were slow and cumbersome. The onlookers, accustomed to precision and skill, offered subtle guidance, correcting her form and providing instruction without overt criticism. Through these early experiences, Annabelle began to grasp the rhythm and logic of the quarters. Every action had consequence, every decision mattered, and every observation contributed to understanding. She noticed how tasks were divided according to skill and strength, how cooperation mitigated the strain of labor, and how small gestures of kindness or support reinforced community bonds. The quarters, chaotic at first glance, revealed an intricate order and system of mutual dependence upon closer inspection. One afternoon, while carrying a basket of freshly harvested cotton to the cabin, Annabelle encountered her first direct test of discretion. A group of children had gathered nearby, arguing over the distribution of food rations. Voices rose, tempers flared, and the potential for intervention by the overseer loomed. Annabelle, uncertain and nervous, instinctively stepped forward to mediate, offering words of comfort and calm. The children hesitated, then gradually responded to her guidance. She realized, in that moment, that even small acts of intervention carried weight and required careful judgment. Her presence could influence outcomes, for better or worse, and she had to act with both empathy and strategic awareness. The evenings in the quarters brought another dimension to Annabelle's adaptation. Life continued beyond the labor, as workers prepared meals, repaired tools, and attended to domestic needs. Conversations, laughter, and whispers created a tapestry of community life, punctuated by the sounds of nightly chores and the quiet conversations of those seeking comfort in each other's presence. Annabelle observed, listened, and gradually became attuned to the subtle rhythms of these interactions. She learned that knowledge was not merely practical but social. Understanding relationships, alliances, and unspoken rules was as critical as mastering the physical tasks at hand. Martha and a few other women took Annabelle under their wing, offering lessons not only in labor but in survival. They taught her the importance of timing, the careful balance between attention and invisibility, and the ways in which discretion could prevent conflict or danger. Annabelle absorbed these teachings, recognizing that her father's punishment had unintentionally provided her with an education unavailable in the mansion, an understanding of resilience, human complexity, and the ethics of care under constrained circumstances. Despite her growing competence, Annabelle experienced moments of profound isolation. The quarters, while communal, highlighted her difference in stark relief. Her upbringing, her status as the master's daughter, and her initial ignorance of labor made her an outsider. She struggled with self-doubt, shame, and the lingering sting of her father's judgment. Yet these moments of introspection were tempered by the realization that adaptation was possible, that growth required effort, and that her presence, though unconventional, could eventually find acceptance if approached with humility and diligence. Over time, the physical and social challenges began to reshape Annabelle's character. Her hands, once delicate and unused to toil, became calloused. Her muscles strengthened, and her stamina improved. Her mind, sharpened by observation and reflection, became more perceptive, attentive to nuance and capable of understanding human behavior in ways previously unexplored. She began to experience empathy, not abstractly, but in direct response to the struggles, resilience, and ingenuity of those around her. By the end of her first year in the quarters, Annabelle was no longer the naive young woman who had arrived with fear and indignation. She had learned the rhythm of labor, the intricacies of social hierarchy, and the subtle language of observation and discretion. She had gained insight into human character, resilience, and morality, recognizing that the measures of worth imposed by her father and society were narrow, superficial, and flawed. The quarters, once a symbol of punishment and humiliation, had become a crucible for growth, understanding, and transformation. Her arrival had also set the stage for deeper relationships and challenges. Friendships would form, conflicts would arise, and her moral consciousness would be tested in ways that demanded courage, judgment, and empathy. The journey she had begun in the first months of her presence in the quarters was only the beginning of a profound evolution, one that would redefine her understanding of self, family, and the society in which she lived. Annabelle Whitcomb's first months in the quarters had stripped her of comfort, privilege, and certainty. Yet, in their place, she began to acquire lessons that no refinement, social etiquette, or polite education could have taught. Life in the quarters was not merely a matter of enduring labor. It was a continuous negotiation with circumstance, morality, and the intricate social webs that allowed enslaved people to survive, endure, and even preserve fragments of autonomy. Annabelle soon realized that adaptation required more than physical resilience. It demanded observation, empathy, patience, and above all, discretion. The earliest lessons were practical. Each day brought new tasks, each with its own rhythm, tools, and methods honed through years of experience. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending clothes, tending small gardens and carrying water became her primary duties. At first, she struggled. The work was physically exhausting, requiring muscles she had seldom used. Her hands blistered from scrubbing floors and washing heavy garments in cold water. Her arms ached from hauling buckets of water and bending repeatedly to tend the garden. Every mistake drew quiet scrutiny from the women who had done these tasks since childhood, and Annabelle quickly recognized that her failures were not only inconvenient, they could mark her as clumsy, weak, or unfit, traits that might alienate her from those around her. Martha, the older enslaved woman who had taken a cautious interest in her, became her first true teacher. She demonstrated the proper way to carry a heavy bucket without spilling, how to scrub the floors efficiently without straining one's back, and the correct techniques for mending torn garments. But beyond the practical instructions, Martha imparted subtle wisdom. "Work is more than just doing," she told Annabelle one afternoon as the sun bore down mercilessly. "It's about watching, learning, and knowing when to step forward and when to hold back. If you move too fast, too slow, or too loud, you make trouble for yourself. Survival is in the details." Annabelle learned to observe the workers closely. She noticed that each person had a distinct method for approaching tasks, a rhythm shaped by strength, experience, and necessity. Some women worked silently, their movements efficient and precise. Others sang quietly as they labored, their voices a soft cadence that seemed to synchronize their efforts. Men in the fields employed tools with practiced skill, their bodies moving in fluid motions honed over years of toil. Annabelle realized that imitation alone would not suffice. She needed to internalize the logic, timing, and strategy behind each motion to perform effectively. Observation extended beyond labor into social interaction. Annabelle quickly discovered that the quarters were governed by unspoken rules. Respect, hierarchy, and alliances were carefully maintained, often communicated through subtle gestures, glances, and tone of voice. Misinterpretation could lead to isolation, conflict, or worse. She began to note the nuances of communication, how a nod from an elder signaled approval, how a sideways glance indicated disapproval, and how whispered warnings could prevent accidents or punishment. The lessons were subtle but critical. Survival required understanding not just what to do, but how, when, and with whom. Annabelle's early mistakes were numerous, yet each carried its own lesson. She once dropped a basket of freshly harvested cotton, scattering the contents across the dirt path. The overseer's sharp glare and the workers' stifled laughter reminded her that error came at a cost. She spent hours cleaning, carrying each piece carefully, and in doing so, she learned patience and attention to detail. Another time, she misread the instructions for mending a tear in a garment, sewing it incorrectly. Martha corrected her, but the lesson lingered. Skill required practice, but mastery required humility and receptiveness to guidance. The physical lessons were inseparable from moral and ethical ones. Annabelle observed how enslaved people treated one another with a combination of care, caution, and strategy. They shared knowledge, protected each other from potential harm, and negotiated social challenges with intelligence and subtlety. She realized that morality in the quarters was practical as well as ethical. It was about survival, solidarity, and maintaining a measure of dignity in the face of oppression. Acts of kindness were often tempered by necessity, yet they were no less significant for their discretion. Discretion itself became a crucial lesson. Annabelle learned quickly that not all actions could be visible, nor all intentions shared openly. Gossip, surveillance, and the ever-present authority of the overseer and master meant that even small missteps could have serious consequences. She learned to measure her words, to act deliberately, and to recognize when silence was more valuable than speech. In this environment, wisdom was as much about restraint as it was about action. The lessons of empathy were perhaps the most profound. Annabelle had grown up in an environment that emphasized class, hierarchy, and social performance, but the quarters exposed her to a different kind of knowledge, the lived reality of people who endured injustice daily, yet maintained resilience, intelligence, and humanity. She observed mothers comforting children after a harsh day in the fields, elders offering advice to younger workers navigating the dangers of labor, and friendships that transcended exhaustion and scarcity. These moments reshaped her understanding of human value, challenging assumptions instilled by family and society. Annabelle also began to understand the complexities of power within the quarters. Though enslaved individuals lacked legal authority, They exercised influence through relationships, skill, and strategy. Small acts, sharing food, offering assistance, providing information, could shift dynamics, protect individuals, or ensure cooperation. Annabelle noticed that those who understood these dynamics thrived, while those who ignored them suffered. The lessons of survival were therefore intertwined with social intelligence. Knowing the personalities, histories, and motivations of those around her was as important as knowing how to cook, clean, or harvest. Conflict was inevitable, and it provided additional lessons. Annabelle encountered moments of tension with peers who resented her intrusion or questioned her competence. One day, a young woman named Selma confronted her over a misunderstanding about shared work in the kitchen. Their voices rose, and the risk of drawing attention from the overseer was real. Through careful listening, apology, and negotiation, Annabelle learned to resolve disputes without escalating them. She realized that conflict management required patience, empathy, and the ability to see the situation from multi-PLE perspectives, a skill that would prove invaluable throughout her time in the quarters. The physical endurance developed in the quarters was inseparable from emotional resilience. Days were long, often beginning before sunrise and ending after sunset, punctuated by chores, meals, and minimal rest. Annabelle discovered muscles she never knew existed, stamina she doubted she could possess, and the ability to push through fatigue while maintaining focus. She also discovered that emotional resilience, the capacity to absorb humiliation, navigate tension, and maintain dignity, was equally important. Each day was a test of mind, body, and spirit. Education, both formal and informal, emerged in unexpected ways. Annabelle learned from observation, from whispered advice, and from hands-on experience. She discovered the practical mathematics of measuring ingredients, the logic of planting rows, and the timing of tending crops. She also absorbed lessons about human behavior, morality, and survival that could not be learned from books or tutors. Knowledge, she realized, was not limited to the mansion or classroom. It existed wherever life demanded intelligence, strategy, and adaptability. Small victories reinforced her learning, completing a task efficiently without oversight, assisting someone discreetly, or navigating a social interaction successfully brought satisfaction and confidence. Each success was proof that she could adapt, that the skills of observation, patience, and empathy were effective tools, and that her father's judgment of her as unmarriageable did not define her worth or potential. Annabelle began to take pride in her abilities, recognizing that her strength lay not in social approval, but in competence, understanding, and moral integrity. Mentorship played a critical role. Martha and a few other seasoned women guided Annabelle, providing instruction not only in labor, but in judgment, discretion, and ethical behavior. They offered lessons in reading situations, predicting outcomes, and balancing personal safety with moral responsibility. Annabelle absorbed these teachings, understanding that true survival required both physical capability and psychological acumen. Her education was holistic, encompassing skill, social intelligence, and ethical reasoning. Annabelle's self-perception evolved alongside her abilities. The shame and humiliation of her father's judgment gradually transformed into a sense of agency. She realized that her value was not determined by marriageability, social approval, or superficial charm, but by her capacity to adapt, understand, and act with integrity. The lessons of survival in the quarters were forging a new identity, one grounded in resilience, empathy, intelligence, and moral awareness. By the end of her first year in the quarters, Annabelle was no longer the fragile, naive young woman her father had condemned. She could perform tasks with skill, navigate complex social networks, manage conflict with prudence, and recognize the subtle interplay of morality and strategy required for survival. Her hands bore the marks of labor, her mind carried the lessons of observation, and her heart had begun to understand empathy and justice in ways that her upbringing had never allowed. The quarters, initially a symbol of punishment and humiliation, had become a crucible for transformation. Annabelle's understanding of work, morality, and human behavior deepened daily. She had learned to balance action with discretion, strength with patience, and empathy with strategy. These lessons, acquired through necessity and observation, would serve as the foundation for her evolving identity, shaping her decisions, relationships, and moral framework in the years to come. Through the relentless rhythm of labor, the subtle instruction of her mentors, and the intricate social dynamics of the quarters, Annabelle discovered that survival was as much about intelligence and ethics as it was about strength. She emerged from each day a little wiser, a little stronger, and more attuned to the complexities of life both within the quarters and beyond. The lessons of survival were no longer abstract. They were lived, embodied, and inseparable from her growing understanding of herself and the world around her. Life in the quarters demanded more than endurance and skill. It required social navigation, the ability to form relationships, and the patience to resolve conflicts without causing harm. For Annabelle Whitcomb, this aspect of her new life proved as challenging as any physical labor. Raised in the insulated world of the mansion, where interactions were carefully curated and authority went unchallenged, she now faced a community where survival depended on understanding human behavior in its most immediate and practical form. Here, friendships could provide safety and support, while conflicts could threaten both well-being and standing within the group. The first friendships Annabelle formed were tentative, built on observation and small gestures of cooperation. Martha, the older woman who had taken on the role of mentor, remained her closest guide. Martha's influence extended beyond labor instruction. She modeled how to interact with others, how to navigate disputes discreetly, and how to extend kindness without exposing oneself to danger. "You must learn to read people, child," Martha said one afternoon as they worked side by side washing clothes. "Some will help you without question, some will challenge you, and some will test you just to see how you respond. Watch, listen, and move carefully. Friendships here are earned, not given freely." Annabelle observed the young women and men around her, noting patterns of behavior and interaction. One young girl, Celia, intrigued Annabelle with her quick wit and fearless approach to tasks. Despite the differences in age and experience, Celia's playful energy and keen intelligence drew Annabelle in. Together, they learned to support one another, sharing advice on how to lift heavy objects without strain, offering encouragement when a task seemed impossible, and exchanging small stories to pass the time. These moments of camaraderie were the foundation of a friendship built on mutual respect, trust, and the understanding that survival depended on cooperation. Yet friendships were not easily maintained. The quarters were a microcosm of tension and hierarchy, where competition for limited resources, attention, and favor could strain relationships. Annabelle quickly learned that jealousy and resentment were common. When she completed tasks efficiently, some workers whispered behind her back, questioning her motives or mocking her successes. Others resented the attention she received from Martha or other respected figures in the quarters. Annabelle began to understand that success was never purely personal. It had social consequences that had to be navigated with care. One conflict arose early in her time among the workers. A young man named Thomas, skilled in fieldwork and respected by peers, became wary of Annabelle's presence. He viewed her as an outsider, someone who had not yet earned her place, and he challenged her authority in a small but pointed manner. During a particularly hot afternoon, as they worked side by side planting rows of cotton, Thomas criticized her technique, drawing the attention of nearby workers. Annabelle felt her frustration rise, tempered only by the memory of Martha's advice, patience, discretion, and careful observation. She responded not with anger, but with measured attention, adjusting her technique and acknowledging his skill. Over time, Thomas's initial hostility softened, and a begrudging respect developed between them, built on competence, humility, and consistency. Conflicts of a more subtle nature also emerged. Gossip, misunderstandings, and cultural differences created tension that required careful negotiation. Annabelle had to learn when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to mediate disputes. She became adept at reading moods, sensing potential conflicts before they escalated, and offering guidance in ways that diffused tension rather than inflaming it. These skills, invisible yet essential, were as crucial to her survival as physical labor. Friendships once established offered more than emotional support. They became practical lifelines. Annabelle learned to share resources discreetly, offer assistance when others were struggling, and provide cover when mistakes occurred. Celia, for instance, taught her how to navigate the early morning routines efficiently, ensuring that chores were completed before overseers arrived. Thomas shared insights into the hidden rhythms of the fields, showing her where the soil required careful attention and where tasks could be expedited. Through these relationships, Annabelle began to recognize the power of collective knowledge and mutual aid in the face of constant challenge. Romantic curios, though subtle, also entered Annabelle's social world. The quarters were a place where human emotions, attraction, and companionship coexisted with labor and survival. Annabelle noticed the glances exchanged between young men and women, the fleeting touches, and the whispered conversations that hinted at budding affection. Though she was cautious, given her status and the precariousness of her position, she could not help but feel a sense of curiosity and, at times, longing. These nascent feelings were tempered by awareness, emotional expression carried risk, and attachment required careful negotiation of trust, discretion, and intention. Annabelle's attempts at forming deeper connections were occasionally met with resistance. Some workers resented her presence, viewing her as privileged and untested. Her mistakes in early tasks, her unfamiliarity with labor, and her status as the master's daughter were points of contention. At first, she encountered subtle exclusion, tasks assigned without consultation, whispered comments behind her back, and avoidance by those who distrusted her motives. These experiences, though painful, provided critical lessons in humility, perseverance, and the long-term cultivation of trust. One significant turning point occurred during a shared labor in the fields. A sudden injury, an overturned basket, and a sprained ankle left a worker named Eliza vulnerable. Annabelle, recognizing the immediate danger, stepped in to assist, carefully supporting Eliza while others offered guidance. This act of quiet courage and empathy shifted perceptions. Observers who had been skeptical began to acknowledge her presence as constructive, recognizing her willingness to act not for personal gain, but to aid others. Trust, once tenuous, began to form, and Annabelle realized that relationships in the quarters required both action and integrity. Friendship and conflict were also intertwined with the lessons of hierarchy and respect. Annabelle noted that some individuals wielded influence not through authority granted by the master, but through skill, experience, and social acumen. Recognizing and respecting these figures was essential. She learned to observe without overstepping, to contribute without dominating, and to seek guidance without appearing dependent. These subtle negotiations shaped her understanding of leadership, cooperation, and the balance between individuality and community. The emotional dimension of friendship was equally important. Annabelle discovered that shared experience, empathy, and solidarity created bonds that extended beyond labor. Conversations during brief rests, quiet exchanges of advice, and moments of laughter amidst hardship reinforced a sense of belonging. Celia, Thomas, and others became not only collaborators, but confidants, teaching Annabelle that connection could be both practical and deeply human. These relationships provided solace in moments of exhaustion, encouragement in times of doubt, and perspective when she grappled with the moral complexities of her environment. Yet conflict remained a constant companion. Misunderstandings, competition, and differing priorities created tension that required careful management. Annabelle learned the art of reconciliation, acknowledging mistakes, offering apologies, and finding compromise. She observed how Martha mediated disputes, balancing fairness with discretion, and began to emulate these strategies. Through trial and error, Annabelle developed a nuanced understanding of human behavior, recognizing that conflict was not merely an obstacle, but a mechanism for growth, negotiation, and social cohesion. The interplay of friendship and conflict extended to her relationship with the overseers. Though their authority was absolute in the fields, subtle negotiation was possible. Annabelle learned to anticipate instructions, complete tasks efficiently, and demonstrate competence without drawing undue attention. Small acts of respect, timely compliance, and thoughtful observation minimized friction, allowing her to maintain positive relationships with those in power, while simultaneously cultivating trust and solidarity among her peers. By the end of her second year in the quarters, Annabelle had transformed socially as much as she had physically. She could navigate friendships with care, mediate conflicts with discretion, and understand the intricate web of relationships that sustained life within the quarters. Her presence, initially disruptive, had become integrated into the social fabric, and her ability to balance empathy, observation, and strategic action had earned her a measure of respect. Friendships had taught her loyalty, cooperation, and the value of shared experience. Conflicts had taught her patience, humility, and the importance of discretion. Together, these lessons shaped her understanding of human nature, morality, and the delicate balance required to thrive in a constrained and complex environment. Annabelle's social education was now inseparable from her physical labor, ethical development, and emerging sense of agency. Her father's earlier judgment, that she was unmarriageable, had defined her in terms of social desirability and superficial standards. Life in the quarters revealed a different metric: competence, integrity, empathy, and resilience. Annabelle's worth was no longer determined by societal approval or appearance, but by her ability to navigate relationships, adapt to challenges, and act with moral intelligence. The friendships she nurtured and the conflicts she resolved became integral to her emerging identity, shaping a young woman capable of leadership, empathy, and thoughtful judgment. Annabelle's experiences in this section of her journey laid the groundwork for more profound moral and ethical awakenings. The bonds she formed, the conflicts she managed, and the lessons she absorbed provided her with a framework for understanding human behavior, injustice, and resilience. Friendships and conflicts were not simply social interactions. They were crucibles for character, shaping her capacity for empathy, courage, and strategic thinking. In conclusion, the complex social landscape of the quarters demanded that Annabelle Whitcomb learn quickly how to form alliances, navigate tensions, and act with both discretion and integrity. Friendships provided support, guidance, and emotional sustenance, while conflicts offered lessons in humility, patience, and negotiation. Together, they taught her that survival was not solely a matter of labor or endurance, but of understanding, connecting, and acting wisely within a community. The relationships she forged and the tensions she managed were pivotal in her transformation from a sheltered, unmarriageable young woman into someone capable of empathy, courage, and moral insight. As Annabelle Whitcomb settled into the rhythm of life in the quarters, she began to witness the harsh realities of the world she had previously been sheltered from. The plantation, which had once appeared to her as a well-ordered and almost idyllic estate from the vantage point of the mansion, revealed itself to be a place defined by power, inequality, and relentless labor. Here, the human cost of wealth, the brutality of the system, and the constant balancing act required for survival were made starkly visible. These revelations forced Annabelle to confront a moral landscape far more complex than she had ever imagined. The first instance of injustice struck her during a routine day in the fields. A young man named Samuel, recently arrived from a neighboring plantation, struggled to keep pace with the work. His hands were raw from labor he had not yet adapted to, and his body faltered under the weight of his tasks. The overseer, a harsh and unyielding man named Mr. Hawkins, noticed Samuel's slowness and struck him with the back of a whip. Annabelle froze, horrified. She had heard of punishments in theory but had never witnessed such immediate physical retribution. The pain etched on Samuel's face, the cries of anguish, and the silence that followed imprinted upon her a visceral understanding of the dangers inherent in the quarters. Martha, who stood nearby, quietly guided Annabelle aside. "Watch, but do not act rashly," she whispered. "There are ways to help, but the wrong move could make things worse, for you and for him." Annabelle nodded, absorbing the lesson that moral action required not only courage but strategy. Intervening without knowledge, without support, or at the wrong moment, could result in additional harm. She realized that survival in the quarters demanded both empathy and careful judgment. Over the ensuing weeks, Annabelle observed patterns of injustice that permeated every aspect of life. Punishments were administered unevenly, often according to the whims of overseers or the perceived status of the worker. Favoritism existed alongside cruelty, and the smallest transgression could trigger severe consequences. Annabelle began to understand that the system was designed not to ensure fairness, but to maintain control, obedience, and efficiency. This awareness awakened in her a growing sense of moral outrage, tempered by the recognition that direct confrontation was rarely safe or effective. Injustice manifested in subtler ways as well. Food was rationed unequally, tools were hoarded or withheld, and opportunities for rest or relief were often granted according to favoritism rather than need. Annabelle observed how these small imbalances accumulated over time, creating stress, resentment, and tension among the workers. She noticed that those who understood these dynamics could navigate the system more effectively, leveraging relationships, timing, and knowledge to protect themselves and others. Annabelle began to grasp that survival required not only physical skill but social intelligence, strategy, and ethical decision-making. One particularly poignant moment occurred when Annabelle encountered a mother struggling to care for her sick child. The child had contracted a fever, likely exacerbated by exhaustion and inadequate nutrition. The mother, despite her own fatigue, was determined to provide comfort and care. Yet she lacked the resources and support to do so effectively. Annabelle offered assistance, fetching water, preparing a simple broth, and staying nearby to provide comfort. Through this experience, she witnessed the intersection of injustice, resilience, and human compassion. Even in the face of systemic oppression, acts of kindness and solidarity persisted, revealing the strength and humanity of those whom society sought to marginalize. Annabelle's observations extended beyond the immediate labor environment. She noticed the broader structures of inequality that governed the plantation and the region. Enslaved people were denied autonomy, subjected to arbitrary authority, and commodified for the profit of their owners. Their lives were constrained by laws, customs, and social expectations designed to suppress resistance and enforce submission. Annabelle began to comprehend the depth of this oppression, recognizing that it was not merely the result of individual cruelty, but a system maintained by economic interest, social norms, and widespread complicity. The moral lessons were compounded by her own position within the hierarchy. As the master's daughter, Annabelle was afforded a measure of protection, privilege, and access that the enslaved workers did not enjoy. She was simultaneously inside and outside the system, witnessing its injustices firsthand while retaining the ability to navigate consequences differently. This duality created both discomfort and opportunity. She felt guilt for her relative safety and privilege, yet she also recognized that her perspective could inform action, careful, measured, and strategic, within the constraints imposed by the environment. Injustice was not limited to overt acts of violence or punishment. Annabelle observed the psychological toll of oppression, the constant vigilance required to avoid disfavor, the suppression of personal expression, and the enduring anxiety of living under surveillance. Workers had to negotiate their words and actions carefully, balancing honesty with caution, loyalty with self-preservation. These dynamics created a complex moral landscape in which ethical choices were rarely straightforward, and where survival often required compromise and subtlety. One day, a dispute arose over a portion of harvested crops. Two workers, each exhausted from the day's labor, claimed ownership of the same bundle. The argument escalated quickly, drawing attention from the overseer. Annabelle, having observed similar conflicts before, intervened cautiously. She proposed a compromise, suggesting that the bundle be divided equally, and the disagreement documented for the overseer's later approval. Her suggestion was accepted, not because she held formal authority, but because it demonstrated practical wisdom and an understanding of fairness within the constraints of the environment. This episode reinforced her understanding that justice in the quarters required negotiation, discretion, and a nuanced approach, rather than rigid adherence to principle alone. Annabelle also witnessed the resilience of those subjected to injustice. Despite physical exhaustion, emotional strain, and systemic oppression, workers found ways to assert agency, protect one another, and preserve dignity. They shared knowledge, offered assistance, and maintained traditions and rituals that reinforced community bonds. Annabelle began to recognize that resilience was not merely about enduring suffering, but about cultivating strategies for survival, solidarity, and subtle resistance. These lessons challenged her previous assumptions about strength, courage, and moral fortitude. The juxtaposition of Annabelle's upbringing and her experiences in the quarters sharpened her moral awareness. She had grown up in a world where appearances, propriety, and social approval determined value. In the quarters, she learned that character, resilience, and empathy were far more important measures of worth. Acts of courage, solidarity, and strategic action revealed depth of character, while superficial markers of status held little relevance. Annabelle began to question the ethical framework of her family, her community, and the society that had deemed her unmarriageable, while perpetuating systemic injustice. Injustice also highlighted the limits of her agency. Annabelle could offer assistance, mediate disputes, and provide support, but she could not dismantle the structures of oppression. She had to learn to act within constraints, choosing interventions carefully to maximize positive impact while minimizing risk. This required judgment, foresight, and moral courage. Each decision carried weight, and miscalculation could have severe consequences, not only for herself but for those around her. Through witnessing injustice, Annabelle's empathy deepened. She began to understand the lived experiences of those subjected to systemic oppression, recognizing both their suffering and their resilience. She learned to listen attentively, observe carefully, and act judiciously. Her moral compass evolved, guided not by abstract principles alone, but by practical considerations, human relationships, and the lived realities of a community navigating oppression. Annabelle's awareness of injustice also fueled a desire to learn and understand more. She asked questions of Martha and other experienced workers, seeking insight into historical patterns, strategies for survival, and the moral reasoning underlying daily choices. She learned about subtle acts of resistance, the ways workers protected one another, and the methods by which they preserved dignity despite relentless oppression. Each story, each observation, reinforced the complexity of life in the quarters and the depth of human resilience. The psychological impact of witnessing injustice was profound. Annabelle experienced frustration, guilt, and anger, emotions previously unfamiliar to her in such intensity. She grappled with the tension between empathy and caution, the desire to intervene and the need to protect herself. These emotional challenges were as demanding as the physical labor, shaping her character, judgment, and moral reasoning. Through reflection, she learned to channel her feelings into strategic action, balancing compassion with prudence. By the end of her first year witnessing injustice in the quarters, Annabelle had gained insights that extended far beyond the confines of the plantation. She had learned to navigate complex social dynamics, recognize ethical nuances, and act with both empathy and strategy. She understood the systemic nature of oppression, the interplay of power and survival, and the moral courage required to act responsibly within constrained circumstances. These lessons would inform her decisions, relationships, and ethical framework in the years to come. Annabelle's experiences revealed a central truth. Justice and morality were not abstract ideals to be applied indiscriminately, but practical principles to be interpreted and enacted within the constraints of a complex, unequal world. Acts of courage, kindness, and solidarity carried real consequences and demanded careful consideration. Survival, integrity, and empathy were intertwined, each reinforcing the other. In conclusion, witnessing injustice transformed Annabelle Whitcomb in ways her father could never have anticipated. Life in the quarters exposed her to physical danger, moral complexity, and the lived realities of systemic oppression. She learned to navigate these challenges with empathy, discretion, and strategic thought. Her moral awareness deepened, her understanding of human behavior sharpened, and her capacity for action within constraints grew. The lessons she absorbed in the face of injustice would remain foundational, shaping her character, judgment, and emerging sense of purpose as she continued her journey within the quarters and beyond. As the months passed in the quarters, Annabelle Whitcomb's transformation became increasingly evident. She was no longer the sheltered, naive girl who had arrived from the mansion, unprepared for labor or the intricate social dynamics of the enslaved community. Her hands bore the calluses of hard work, her body had grown stronger and more resilient, and her mind had become attuned to observation, strategy, and empathy. But it was in moments of moral challenge, when danger and injustice intersected, that Annabelle's courage was truly tested, and where the lessons of survival crystallized into acts of bravery. The first significant act of courage occurred during a hot afternoon in the fields. Samuel, the young man who had struggled with the pace of labor, was once again struggling under the overseer's watchful eye. The overseer, Mr. Hawkins, had little patience for perceived weakness. Samuel faltered, dropping a heavy bundle of cotton, and the whip cracked in the air, its sound both sharp and terrifying. Annabelle, who had learned to balance observation with discretion, felt an instinctive urge to intervene. Yet, she knew that acting rashly could bring punishment upon herself or worsen Samuel's situation. Drawing upon the lessons imparted by Martha and her growing understanding of the quarters' dynamics, she acted with precision and timing. She stepped forward quietly, helping Samuel to stabilize the bundle and redirecting his efforts without drawing overt attention from the overseer. Her actions were subtle, almost invisible, yet they carried profound significance. Samuel was spared further injury, and Annabelle earned the quiet respect of those who witnessed her discretion and courage. She had learned that bravery did not always involve confrontation. It could also be found in strategic action, careful intervention, and protection offered without fanfare. This understanding would guide many of her subsequent acts of courage, each shaped by context, timing, and moral awareness. Another test of courage arose within the quarters themselves, where interpersonal tensions occasionally escalated into open conflict. A young woman named Selma, previously wary of Annabelle's presence, faced a dispute over shared resources, tools, food, and workspace. The argument threatened to draw the attention of the overseer, which could result in punishment for both parties. Annabelle, recalling previous lessons in mediation and the subtle dynamics of the community, intervened. She proposed a compromise, distributing the disputed resources in a manner that addressed both parties' needs while avoiding escalation. Her intervention required confidence, diplomacy, and courage, for any misstep could have drawn punitive attention or social backlash, yet the outcome was successful. The conflict was diffused, and her reputation as someone capable of careful, courageous action grew. Physical danger also became a recurring arena in which Annabelle's courage was tested. One sweltering summer afternoon, a fire broke out near the quarters. A discarded ember from a cooking fire ignited the dry grass, spreading rapidly toward the cabins. Panic surged as workers scrambled to protect their homes, children, and livestock. Annabelle, despite her fear, acted decisively. She helped to form a bucket brigade, coordinating efforts to douse flames, guiding children to safety, and assisting those who were injured or trapped. Her leadership was marked by calm decisiveness, an ability to anticipate hazards, and the courage to act under extreme pressure. The fire was eventually contained with minimal damage, and Annabelle's role in the response earned her the trust and admiration of the community. Courage was not only physical or strategic, but also moral. Annabelle witnessed injustices that demanded intervention, often at personal risk. She observed Mr. Hawkins administering harsh punishments to workers for minor mistakes. Though she could not openly challenge the overseer, she found ways to mitigate harm. She discreetly offered assistance to those punished, providing water, tending wounds, and offering words of reassurance. These acts, though subtle, required moral fortitude, for they involved navigating a delicate balance between compassion and self-preservation. One particularly striking act of moral courage involved a child named Lila, whose health had been compromised by exhaustion and illness. Lila's mother, overwhelmed by her own labor demands, struggled to provide adequate care. Annabelle recognized the danger and took it upon herself to intervene. She prepared meals, fetched water, and remained vigilant in monitoring the child's condition. Her actions went beyond simple kindness. They were a conscious, courageous choice to protect a vulnerable life within a system that often disregarded the welfare of its youngest members. Through these efforts, Annabelle demonstrated that courage could manifest as care, compassion, and proactive moral responsibility. The complexity of her courageous acts deepened as Annabelle navigated relationships within the quarters. Friendships, while supportive, also presented challenges that required bravery. She sometimes had to mediate disputes, protect peers from unjust accusations, or advocate for fairness in situations where she held no formal authority. Each intervention demanded judgment, emotional resilience, and a willingness to assume responsibility for outcomes that were often uncertain. These experiences reinforced her understanding that courage was not a singular act but a sustained practice, involving repeated decisions to act ethically in the face of risk. Annabelle's evolving moral awareness allowed her to recognize the interconnectedness of actions and consequences. She understood that interventions could ripple through the community, affecting not only those directly involved but also the broader social fabric. Her courage, therefore, was tempered by strategy. She chose her moments carefully, considered potential outcomes, and acted in ways that maximized positive impact while minimizing harm. This balance between moral conviction and practical foresight became a defining feature of her character. The quarters themselves provided ongoing lessons in courage through observation. Annabelle watched how experienced workers navigated threats from overseers, protected one another from harm, and maintained dignity under oppression. She learned to recognize subtle acts of defiance, small gestures, whispered warnings, and covert strategies that preserved autonomy and morale. These examples inspired her, illustrating that courage could be measured not only in dramatic confrontations but also in persistent, thoughtful resistance. One day, a particularly challenging situation arose involving Thomas, the young man who had initially been wary of Annabelle's presence. He faced unjust punishment for a minor mistake in the field, and the overseer's anger threatened to escalate into physical violence. Annabelle intervened discreetly, using her knowledge of the overseer's routines and her growing influence within the quarters to redirect attention and protect Thomas from harm. Her actions required not only courage, but also an understanding of timing, authority, and social dynamics. Thomas survived the encounter unscathed, and Annabelle's reputation as a courageous and intelligent actor was further solidified. Acts of courage were also interwoven with personal growth. Annabelle learned to confront fear, manage anxiety, and act decisively despite uncertainty. Each successful intervention reinforced her confidence, while each misstep provided valuable lessons in judgment, strategy, and humility. Over time, courage became not an occasional display but an integral aspect of her identity, a lens through which she approached challenges, relationships, and ethical dilemmas. The moral and ethical dimension of courage was especially pronounced in situations that involved protecting vulnerable members of the quarters. Annabelle witnessed the delicate balance required to ensure safety without drawing punitive attention. She learned to anticipate risks, coordinate discreet assistance, and provide support in ways that reinforced dignity and autonomy. These acts required empathy, foresight, and moral integrity, highlighting the complexity of courage in a constrained and oppressive environment. Annabelle's courage was further tested by moments that required direct confrontation. On one occasion, a worker accused of theft faced severe punishment, and the atmosphere was tense with fear and anticipation. Annabelle, understanding the broader context and the truth of the matter, intervened by quietly presenting evidence and testimony that clarified the situation. Her actions were risky, as they challenged the immediate authority of the overseer, but they ultimately prevented unjust punishment. This episode reinforced her understanding that courage often involved calculated risk, moral clarity, and a commitment to justice. The cumulative effect of these acts of courage transformed Annabelle's standing within the quarters. She became a trusted figure, not because of her social status as the master's daughter, but because of her demonstrated reliability, empathy, and moral intelligence. Workers sought her guidance, valued her interventions, and included her in decision-making processes. Her influence was subtle but meaningful, reflecting the respect earned through consistent ethical action rather than imposed authority. Annabelle's courage also extended to self-reflection and personal accountability. She recognized the limitations of her knowledge, the risks inherent in intervention, and the need for continuous learning. Each act of bravery was accompanied by reflection. What were the consequences? Could the outcome have been improved? Did the intervention respect the dignity and autonomy of those involved? This process of reflection reinforced her growth, ensuring that courage was always tempered by wisdom and responsibility. By the end of her time in the quarters, Annabelle's acts of courage were no longer isolated incidents, but a consistent pattern of ethical and practical engagement. She had learned to navigate danger, protect others, mediate conflicts, and intervene thoughtfully in situations of injustice. Her courage was informed by experience, observation, and moral reasoning, making her a formidable presence despite her youth and original social status. In conclusion, Annabelle Whitcomb's experiences in the quarters revealed the multifaceted nature of courage. It was physical, moral, strategic, and relational, requiring observation, empathy, and foresight. Through subtle interventions, acts of protection, and thoughtful engagement with injustice, she demonstrated bravery that went beyond mere fearlessness. Her courage was rooted in an understanding of context, consequence, and ethical responsibility. These acts not only safeguarded those around her but also solidified her own moral and social identity, marking her transformation from a sheltered, unmarriageable young woman into someone capable of agency, leadership, and profound moral insight. The years Annabelle Whitcomb spent in the quarters had reshaped her in ways that were both profound and irreversible. When she first arrived, she was a fragile, unmarriageable girl, confined by the narrow expectations of her father and the world of the mansion. She had been instructed in etiquette, decorum, and superficial accomplishments, yet she had no preparation for the complexities of life beyond the polished floors and crystal chandeliers. The quarters had become her crucible, forging resilience, wisdom, and moral awareness through labor, observation, and human interaction. By the time she reached the end of her stay, she had undergone a transformation that extended far beyond physical endurance or social skill. She had become someone capable of profound empathy, strategic thought, and courageous moral action. The first aspect of Annabelle's transformation was physical. Her hands, once delicate and untested, bore the calluses of months and years of labor. Her arms, shoulders, and back had grown strong from lifting, carrying, and planting. Muscles she had never known now allowed her to complete tasks with efficiency and skill. Each movement in the fields or the cabins was no longer awkward but deliberate, informed by observation and repetition. The physicality of her existence in the quarters was more than survival, it was empowerment. She had learned that strength was not only bodily but also mental, and that endurance, physical, emotional, and moral, was the foundation upon which all other aspects of her growth rested. The second aspect of her transformation was social. Annabelle had entered the quarters as an outsider, her social status and her father's shadow both alienating and exposing her. She was forced to navigate complex networks of relationships, hierarchies, and alliances without formal authority or guaranteed respect. Through careful observation, subtle negotiation, and repeated acts of integrity, she earned the trust and respect of those around her. Friendships developed into mutual support networks, and conflicts became lessons in empathy, patience, and discretion. Annabelle learned to mediate disputes, anticipate challenges, and offer assistance in ways that reinforced social cohesion. Her presence, initially disruptive, became integrated into the rhythms of the quarters. She had not only adapted, but had also become a valued and influential member of the community. The moral dimension of her transformation was perhaps the most profound. Annabelle had witnessed systemic injustice, harsh punishments, and the inequities inherent in the plantation system. She had seen suffering that she could neither ignore nor fully prevent. These experiences forced her to confront the limitations of privilege, the responsibilities of empathy, and the complexities of ethical action. Through acts of courage, whether intervening subtly to prevent harm, supporting the sick, or mediating conflicts, she developed a nuanced understanding of morality. Annabelle realized that ethical behavior was not merely adherence to rules, but required discernment, foresight, and a willingness to act despite risk. Courage and compassion were inseparable, and true moral action often required subtlety and strategic thinking. Reflection became a critical part of her transformation. Each day in the quarters offered opportunities for observation, introspection, and learning. She reflected on her mistakes, celebrated her successes, and considered the consequences of her actions on those around her. This habit of reflection strengthened her judgment and deepened her understanding of human behavior. She learned to recognize patterns of injustice, predict outcomes, and make informed choices that balanced personal safety, communal well-being, and ethical responsibility. Over time, reflection became a guiding principle in her life, ensuring that each act of courage or kindness was deliberate, considered, and effective. Annabelle also learned the power of resilience. Life in the quarters was defined by adversity, harsh labor, scarce resources, and constant oversight. Yet she observed resilience not only in herself but in every person around her. Workers endured exhaustion, pain, and injustice, while preserving dignity, nurturing relationships, and sustaining hope. She saw mothers comforting children, elders guiding the young, and friends protecting one another through subtle acts of solidarity. This resilience was not passive endurance. It was active engagement with the challenges of life and assertion of humanity in the face of dehumanization. Annabelle absorbed these lessons deeply, understanding that resilience required both inner strength and communal support. Another crucial aspect of her transformation was the development of empathy. Initially, Annabelle's understanding of the lives of the enslaved workers was superficial, shaped by curiosity and limited observation. Over time, however, she began to grasp the full weight of their experiences, the constant labor, the precariousness of survival, the subtle and overt injustices, and the courage required to navigate such a world. She learned to recognize the humanity in every gesture, to value insight as much as skill, and to respond with care and understanding. Her empathy became informed by experience, reflection, and moral reasoning, enabling her to act not out of obligation or pity, but from a genuine commitment to justice and compassion. The transformation was not without emotional complexity. Annabelle grappled with guilt, frustration, and fear, emotions that surfaced as she witnessed suffering she could not fully alleviate. The tension between her privilege and the oppression she observed created discomfort and self-reflection. Yet these emotions became catalysts for growth, rather than impediments. They pushed her to act thoughtfully, to balance courage with discretion, and to seek solutions that honored both morality and pragmatism. Annabelle learned that emotional intelligence, the capacity to recognize, manage, and channel emotions, was as vital to survival and moral action as physical skill or social acumen. Her transformation also included a redefinition of personal identity. Annabelle began to measure her worth not by societal expectations, her father's judgment, or superficial appearances, but by competence, ethical behavior, empathy, and resilience. The label of unmarriageable, lost its power as she discovered the strength, intelligence, and moral clarity she possessed. She understood that her value lay not in external validation but in her ability to act wisely, courageously, and compassionately within the constraints of her environment. This shift in self-perception was liberating, allowing her to embrace agency, responsibility, and a deeper understanding of human dignity. The cumulative effect of these experiences was a profound sense of interconnectedness. Annabelle realized that every action had consequences that extended beyond herself. Intervening to assist someone in the field, mediating a dispute, or offering care to the sick created ripples throughout the community. Similarly, acts of injustice or negligence had broader effects, reinforcing the importance of responsibility, awareness, and ethical engagement. Annabelle's understanding of interconnectedness reinforced her commitment to thoughtful, courageous action, and shaped her approach to relationships, labor, and moral dilemmas. By the end of her time in the quarters, Annabelle's transformation was visible to all who knew her. Workers respected her judgment, observed her courage, and trusted her discretion. Overseers recognized her competence and reliability, even if they remained unaware of the moral and ethical growth she had undergone. Annabelle herself recognized the distance she had traveled from the timid, untested girl who had first arrived. She had learned resilience, empathy, moral reasoning, social intelligence, and strategic action. Her education in the quarters, though unconventional and born of hardship, had equipped her with a profound understanding of life, humanity, and her own capabilities. Reflection upon her experiences also revealed the limitations of her previous world. The mansion, with its rules, decorum, and expectations, had offered a narrow vision of life. The quarters had expanded her understanding, showing her the depth of human experience, the complexity of ethical action, and the courage required to live with integrity under oppression. Annabelle came to understand that true education was not measured in accomplishments, etiquette, or approval, but in the capacity to observe, understand, and act with wisdom, empathy, and courage. The moral and ethical lessons of her time in the quarters would stay with Annabelle long after she left. She had learned that injustice required response, but that response must be informed by observation, strategy, and empathy. She understood that courage was multifaceted, encompassing physical bravery, moral conviction, and strategic discretion. She had witnessed resilience, nurtured friendships, and mediated conflicts, gaining a comprehensive understanding of human behavior and ethical responsibility. Her transformation was not merely survival, it was the cultivation of character, wisdom, and moral fortitude. Annabelle also recognized the significance of memory and storytelling. The experiences, relationships, and lessons of the quarters were not solely for personal growth, they were also a repository of history, culture, and resilience. She understood the importance of bearing witness, preserving stories, and acknowledging the humanity of those whose lives were constrained by oppression. Her reflection included gratitude for the mentorship of individuals like Martha, the courage of her peers, and the shared humanity that had sustained life in the quarters despite adversity. In reflecting upon her journey, Annabelle saw the integration of all aspects of her transformation: physical endurance, social intelligence, moral courage, empathy, resilience, and reflection were not separate skills, but interconnected elements of her evolving identity. Each challenge, act of courage, friendship, and conflict had contributed to a cohesive understanding of life within the quarters and beyond. She recognized that transformation was an ongoing process, one that required continuous engagement with the world, ethical reflection, and the courage to act despite uncertainty. Ultimately, Annabelle's transformation was a reclamation of agency and humanity. She had entered the quarters as a subject of her father's judgment and society's expectations. She emerged as a self-aware, morally grounded, and courageous individual, capable of acting ethically, supporting others, and navigating the complexities of a constrained and unequal world. Her identity was no longer defined by external labels or superficial standards, but by her actions, choices, and moral integrity. The lessons of her transformation extended beyond personal growth. Annabelle had developed a profound understanding of justice, empathy, and resilience that could inform her interactions with others and her broader role in society. She had learned that leadership and influence were not conferred by privilege but earned through integrity, competence, and ethical action. She understood that morality required courage, strategy, and attentiveness to context, and that human dignity could be preserved and nurtured even in the harshest circumstances. In conclusion, Annabel Whitcomb's time in the quarters represented a journey of profound transformation. Through labor, observation, reflection, and ethical engagement, she developed physical resilience, social intelligence, moral courage, and empathetic insight. She navigated injustice, formed friendships, mediated conflicts, and acted courageously in the face of danger. Her experiences reshaped her understanding of self, human behavior, and moral responsibility, allowing her to emerge as a capable, courageous, and ethically grounded individual. The lessons she carried would remain with her for the rest of her life, a testament to the transformative power of adversity, observation, and deliberate action. Annabel's journey revealed that true growth is often born of hardship, and that the crucible of life, when approached with empathy, courage, and reflection, can forge character, wisdom, and enduring strength.